1831, the entire town of Millbrook, South Carolina, made an impossible decision. They banished a family forever, not for theft, not for violence, but for something far worse. The Blackwood family had committed crimes so twisted that their own neighbors would rather face starvation than share the same soil. What they did in that cursed farmhouse still haunts the land today. And the terrifying part? Some say they never really left. The autumn of 1831 brought an early frost to Millbrook. Crops withered in the fields, and families prepared for a harsh winter. But inside the Blackwood farmhouse, something entirely different was growing. Something that would make the cold seem like mercy. Jeremiah Blackwood owned the largest farm outside town limits. His wife Martha bore him 5 children, each more peculiar than the last. The eldest, Samuel, spoke to empty rooms. The twins, Mary and Margaret, shared thoughts that weren't their own. Young Thomas collected insects in glass jars, whispering secrets to their dying bodies. And little Sarah, barely 6 years old, drew pictures of people who hadn't died yet. The family kept to themselves, which suited the townspeople fine. Strange families weren't uncommon in the Carolina backwoods, but the Blackwoods weren't just strange. They were wrong in ways that made your skin crawl when the wind carried their scent. It started with the animals. Jeremiah's livestock lived longer than they should have. Much longer. His prize bull, Old Titan, had been ancient when Jeremiah inherited the farm 15 years earlier. Yet the beast still roamed the pastures, its eyes clouded white with age that refused to claim it. The chickens laid eggs with yolks so dark they looked like blood, and the family's 3 dogs never aged a single day. Martha Blackwood rarely came to town, but when she did, people noticed things. Her shadow fell in the wrong direction. Flowers wilted when she passed, and children who looked directly at her face would wake up screaming for weeks afterward. The local preacher, Reverend Collins, tried visiting the Blackwood farm once. He returned to town pale and shaking, refusing to speak of what he'd seen. He only muttered about altars that shouldn't exist and prayers said backwards under a blood-red moon. Within a month, Reverend Collins packed his belongings and left Millbrook forever. But the true horror began in late September, when people started disappearing. First, it was old Henrik, the town drunk. Nobody worried when he didn't stumble home from the tavern. But then his wife found his boots by Blackwood Creek, filled with something that wasn't mud. Next came the Fletcher boy, young Peter, who'd been dared to peek into the Blackwood windows after dark. His friends waited by the road all night, but Peter never returned. They found his lantern smashed against a tree, the glass arranged in patterns that hurt to look at. The disappearances accelerated. Martha Gentry vanished while collecting herbs in the woods near Blackwood property. Tom Bradley's horse came back alone, its mane braided with human hair that wasn't Tom's. The widow Morrison simply never answered her door one morning, though neighbors swore they heard her talking to someone inside until dawn. Each time, the only clue was the same. Footprints led toward the Blackwood farm, but none led away. The town council called emergency meetings. Sheriff Davidson organized search parties that found nothing but shadows moving wrong between the trees. Desperate families hired trackers from Charleston, but even the bloodhounds refused to follow scents that led toward Blackwood land. And through it all, the Blackwood family continued their daily routines as if nothing had changed. They still visited town for supplies, still nodded politely to neighbors on the street. But people began to notice more disturbing details. Samuel Blackwood now wore rings that looked familiar. The twins carried lockets that belonged to missing women. Young Thomas had acquired new specimens for his collection. Butterflies pinned to boards, their wings still trying to flutter. And little Sarah's drawings had grown more accurate. She sketched the faces of people who would vanish the following week. If you've ever wondered how far a community will go to protect itself, subscribe to learn what desperate measures can drive ordinary people to consider, because what happened next would test every moral boundary Millbrook thought it had. By October, 1/3 of the town's population had either disappeared or fled. Those who remained barricaded their homes after sunset, and prayed to whatever god still listened. The Blackwoods had grown bolder, visiting town in broad daylight, their smiles too wide and their eyes reflecting light like animal pupils. Martha Blackwood began speaking to people in voices that belonged to the missing. She would approach grieving widows and whisper secrets only their dead husbands could have known. She told children bedtime stories their vanished parents had invented. She hummed lullabies that existed nowhere but in private memories. The breaking point came on Halloween night, though nobody called it that back then. They simply knew October 31st as the night when the veil between worlds grew thin. The night when the Blackwood family threw open their doors and invited the entire town to witness what they'd been building in the darkness. The invitation arrived as black smoke that spelled words in the air above every household. Come to the harvest feast. Bring your appetites. Bring your children. Bring your willingness to join us in eternity. Most families ignored the summons, but curiosity claimed a few. The brave ones. The foolish ones. They walked the dirt road to Blackwood Farm as the sun died behind storm clouds that had appeared from nowhere. What they found still defies description, though survivors tried for decades to explain it. The farmhouse had grown, not expanded, grown, like living tissue spreading across the landscape. Windows opened onto rooms that couldn't possibly fit inside. Doors led to hallways that stretched beyond the horizon. And in the center of it all, a dining room table that seated dozens of guests who weren't quite breathing. The missing townspeople sat in chairs made from bones, their eyes reflecting candlelight that cast no shadows. They smiled with lips that moved wrong and spoke in harmonies that human throats couldn't produce. They were alive, but not in any way that mattered to the living world. Jeremiah Blackwood stood at the head of the table, carving something that resembled meat, but moved like it was trying to escape. His wife Martha conducted conversations with empty air, nodding and laughing at responses only she could hear. The children played games involving dice made from teeth and cards that changed suits while you watched. The few townspeople who witnessed this scene and escaped would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget the invitation that followed. The Blackwood family offered them seats at the eternal feast, promised them reunion with everyone they'd lost, guaranteed them protection from death, disease, and the ordinary sufferings of mortal life. All they had to do was partake in the harvest meal, just one bite. 3 people accepted. Martha Sullivan, crazed with grief over her missing husband. Young Billy Thornton, barely 18 and desperate to see his vanished sweetheart again. And Dr. Henley, the town physician, who believed he could study whatever force had claimed his patients. They took their seats. They lifted the offered morsels to their lips. And as their teeth broke skin, their screams became laughter that echoed from mouths that no longer belonged entirely to them. The remaining witnesses fled into the night, their terrified reports reaching town by dawn. But when Sheriff Davidson led an armed group to investigate the next morning, they found only the original farmhouse, silent and empty. No expanded rooms, no impossible architecture, no dining tables stretching toward infinity. Just an ordinary farm with ordinary buildings and ordinary shadows falling in ordinary directions. But the 3 who had accepted the invitation were gone, and that night people reported seeing them walking the streets of Millbrook, knocking on doors and extending invitations of their own. The harvest feast wasn't over. It was spreading. The town council met in emergency session. They'd lost too many neighbors to mysterious disappearances. They'd witnessed horrors that challenged their understanding of reality, and now the corruption was actively recruiting new members from among the living. The decision they reached violated every principle of justice and due process they'd sworn to uphold. But desperate times had pushed them beyond the boundaries of civilized law. They would banish the Blackwood family forever. Not arrest them, not try them in court, not even execute them according to legal procedure. They would gather every able-bodied man in town, surround the Blackwood property, and force the family to leave South Carolina permanently. If they refused, the townspeople would burn them out. If they resisted, the townspeople would use whatever force proved necessary. It was exile without trial, Punishment without evidence that would stand up in any legitimate court. But the alternative was watching their community disappear one neighbor at a time until nothing remained but empty houses and the sound of laughter that came from mouths that used to belong to people they loved. On November 15th, 1831, 47 men surrounded the Blackwood farm at sunrise. They carried rifles, torches, and a determination born from months of supernatural terror. Sheriff Davidson stepped forward and delivered the ultimatum: leave South Carolina within 24 hours or face the consequences. Jeremiah Blackwood emerged from his house alone. He looked exactly as he had 15 years earlier when he'd first arrived in Millbrook. No gray in his hair, no lines on his face, no signs that time had touched him at all while everyone else had aged. He listened to the sheriff's demands without expression. Then he smiled. "You think you're banishing us?" he said in a voice that somehow reached every man present despite speaking barely above a whisper. "You think you're reclaiming your town, but you're simply choosing a different kind of harvest." The family departed that afternoon. Jeremiah, Martha, and their 5 children loaded a single wagon with belongings that seemed to shift and multiply when nobody was looking directly at them. They drove away down the main road while the entire population of Millbrook watched from doorways and windows. Nobody followed them. Nobody wanted to know where they went. For 3 months, life in Millbrook returned to something resembling normal. The disappearances stopped. The shadows fell in proper directions. Children stopped waking up screaming from dreams they couldn't remember, but normal proved to be a temporary luxury. In February 1832, travelers began reporting strange encounters on the roads leading out of South Carolina. A family in a covered wagon that appeared suddenly from thin air. Children who offered directions to destinations that didn't exist on any map. A woman who sold preserves that tasted like memories you'd rather forget. Other towns began experiencing their own mysterious disappearances. Augusta, Georgia lost 12 residents over 2 weeks. Savannah reported livestock that aged backwards and flowers that bloomed in winter. Charlotte, North Carolina found footprints that led nowhere and shadows that moved independently of their owners. The Blackwood family hadn't been destroyed. They'd simply been set loose to spread their particular form of corruption across a wider territory. Meanwhile, in Millbrook, people began to realize they'd made a terrible mistake. The 3 townspeople who'd accepted the harvest invitation, Martha Sullivan, Billy Thornton, and Dr. Henley, hadn't left with the Blackwood family. They remained in town, continuing their ordinary lives with one crucial difference. They were recruiting. Martha Sullivan visited grieving families and offered comfort that came at a price. She would whisper locations where lost loved ones could be found, but only if the searchers agreed to specific conditions. Bring offerings to particular crossroads. Speak certain words at midnight. Accept help that required no immediate payment but established debts that would come due eventually. Billy Thornton courted young women with flowers that never wilted and promises that never broke. His sweethearts found themselves dreaming of weddings that would last forever. Literally. Ceremonies where death was just another guest at the celebration and the vows extended beyond any mortal understanding of eternity. Dr. Henley treated patients with remedies that worked too well. Broken bones that healed stronger than before. Illnesses that vanished completely but left people craving sickness again. And always, he offered special treatments for those willing to pay in currencies that had nothing to do with money. The corruption hadn't left Millbrook. It had simply learned to hide better. But the worst realization was yet to come. In April 1832, a traveling merchant brought news from the road. He'd encountered a family matching the Blackwood description near the Tennessee border. They'd invited him to share their campfire and offered him preserves from a jar that never seemed to empty. The merchant had politely declined and continued on his way. But something about the encounter bothered him enough to ask questions in the next town he reached. The locals told him about recent disappearances, about livestock aging backwards, about children drawing pictures of people who hadn't died yet. The pattern was spreading, and it was accelerating. The merchant's news confirmed what the people of Millbrook had begun to suspect. They hadn't solved their problem by banishing the Blackwood family. They'd simply made it everyone else's problem while keeping a smaller portion of the corruption for themselves. The harvest feast was still being served, just at different tables now. And somewhere in the darkness between towns, on roads that led everywhere and nowhere, a family in a covered wagon continued their eternal journey. Jeremiah Blackwood drove horses that never tired. Martha hummed lullabies that belonged to other people's memories. The children played games with rules that changed depending on who was watching. They were looking for their next home, their next harvest, their next opportunity to offer eternal feast to people who didn't understand the true cost of accepting such invitations. The people of Millbrook had learned too late that some evils can't be banished. They can only be passed along to the next town, the next county, the next generation of people who think they're strong enough to handle what previous communities couldn't destroy. But here's what the history books never recorded about the Blackwood family. Here's the detail that makes this story more than just another tale of supernatural revenge. They're still out there. Travel the back roads of the Carolinas on foggy nights, and you might encounter a wagon that appears from nowhere. A family that offers directions to places you didn't know you wanted to visit. Children who wave from windows that shouldn't exist in vehicles that cast no shadows under moonlight. If you're smart, you'll politely decline whatever they're offering and continue on your way. Don't accept their preserves, no matter how hungry you are. Don't let them tell your fortune, no matter how curious you become. And whatever you do, don't agree to join them for dinner, because the harvest feast never ends. It just finds new guests. The town of Millbrook still exists, though it's grown considerably since 1831. Modern residents know nothing about the Blackwood family or the banishment that scattered supernatural corruption across multiple states. They've forgotten the names of neighbors who vanished into thin air, and the children who drew pictures of deaths that hadn't happened yet. But sometimes, on Halloween night, when the veil between worlds grows thin, people report seeing lights in the windows of houses that shouldn't exist. They hear laughter that comes from voices they almost recognize, and they find invitations written in smoke, inviting them to feasts where the only requirement for admission is a willingness to stay forever. The Blackwood family is still sending invitations, still offering seats at their eternal table, still promising reunion with everyone you've ever lost, protection from everything you've ever feared. All you have to do is take one bite. But before you consider accepting, remember what happened to the people who thought they could banish evil by simply moving it somewhere else. Remember that some hungers can never be satisfied, only shared. And remember that the most dangerous invitations are the ones that promise exactly what you think you want. The harvest feast continues. The question is whether you'll be serving dinner.